Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome a regular and much esteemed guest on Blogging and Theology, Dilly Hussain. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Paul, jazakallah khair for inviting me on again, and salams to all the listeners and viewers and supporters. Assalamu alaikum.
Fantastic. Thank you. Dilly is Deputy Editor of 5 Pillars UK, the UK-based news site covering current affairs related to Islam and Muslims. He's also the host of the Blood Brothers podcast, and links we put into these in the description below. Do follow them up. Now, as we all know, there has been momentous political changes in Syria recently with the overthrow of the hated Assad regime and the liberation of the Syrian people from tyranny. And Dilly has been to Syria very recently and met the HTS leadership, including Abu Mohammed Al-Julani, the leader of HTS. And if you follow Dilly on Twitter, you'll be able to see some photographs of that. He actually attended a meeting with Al-Julani for a question and answer session. So my first question, Dilly, for you is, what were your impressions of Al-Julani? I mean, some people, for example, claim that he's an American agent, or has he made some kind of deal with them? What's the truth? What were your impressions of the man?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. So 2 parts of your question. Question number 1 is my personal impressions of Ahmad al-Shara, or more widely known and better known as Abu Muhammad al-Julani. And the second question is obviously a very widespread assumption, rumor, suspicion, claim amongst the critics of the Syrian revolution. My first impression was that he looked tired. He looked exhausted, a very softly spoken man. And even though I am not fluent in the Arabic language, I had an interpreter with me. Shout out to Brother Obeidah from TRT, who was a godsend on that day. And he's clearly a head of state in the making. Now, he's already the head of state. In theory, he is the de facto leader of Syria as we speak. But in terms of the decorum, the way you carry yourself, he certainly has changed outwardly from the kind of caricaturing jihadist leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, which is the popular depiction we have of Mr. Shara. Now, many have asked me, did he give you like this Sultan and Khalifa feeling? What does that even mean? No, he didn't give me that type of energy. He just seemed like someone who looked quite exhausted and tired. And
well, not surprising.
Yeah, I mean, that stood out. I mean, he had like dark eye bags, but he was softly spoken. Very clear in his speech, very succinct in his responses, but not necessarily answering questions directly, which again is an indication of a politician in the making. What you would tend to find with at least your stereotypical jihadist groups is very no mincing of the words, isn't it, Paul? There's no mincing of the words. I mean, if you look at leaders of Salafi jihadi groups, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS, past and present, very unequivocal in their intentions and motives. That certainly was not the case with Mr. Shara. So that gave me the feeling that this is certainly a politician in the making, or already made. You know, to see him in a suit, now see him in a tie, and so these are all things which the media and observers are picking up on, because you'd have thought if this was what many Western pundits continue to claim, is that a kind of a facelift of Al-Qaeda, then that's very strange, because even the issue of wearing a tie has religious difference of opinion amongst at least those who are somewhat Salafi leaning or Deobandi leaning, about the wearing of the tie, and it represents the cross and it's not from our tradition and orphan. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah. No, I'm saying that people are picking up on all these kind of things about Mr. Shara. Like even there was the viral video that went around where an uncovered sister wanted to take a picture with him, and he just politely just said, "Put something on your head," and she did. And then she defended that. She goes, "It was me who was requesting a picture with Mr. Shara, so I understood that he wanted me to put the headscarf on." You know, and so there is this kind of softening of coverage of how he's been presented. I mean, keep in mind, this is the leader of a prescribed terrorist organization. I know for sure we wouldn't be speaking and talking about Abu Ubaidah of Hamas like this. or even the leadership of Hizb ut-Tahrir, who were recently banned in the UK. We wouldn't be talking about them so fondly and warmly and so forgivingly. But we are getting this with Mr. Shara, which indicates two things. If you believe what the detractors of the Syrian revolution say, they would say that no, a deal has been made with the Americans, some kind of deal has been made with NATO, and the key condition of this deal would be that Israel would be left unharmed and to advance their buffer zone. Or the other side is that the West and others have now got no other choice but to deal with Mr. Shara.
Mm-hmm.
He is the one that successfully led Operation Deterring Aggression, with the assistance of the Syrian National Army in the north, who are backed and armed by the Turks, or the southern rebel groups who are kind of funded and trained by the UAE and Jordan, and other groups. So he headed that, he led that, and he successfully toppled this regime, which we're gonna discuss later on how and why and timing and how is it even possible, whose hand was involved and whose hand wasn't involved. So my impressions is that this is a politician in the making, a head of state already made. His answers, his demeanor, his decorum absolutely gave the aura of someone who's looking to lead a state at a critical juncture.
I saw him just yesterday on Al Jazeera program, meeting with the top diplomat from Jordan, and this diplomat and Al-Julani both wearing suits and ties, and it looked very presidential, very kind of normal, so to speak, for Middle East rulers to look like that and talk like that. So already he's assuming this mantle of this presidential aura.
He's received the Qatari foreign minister, he's received the Jordanian foreign minister, he spent pretty much the whole day with the Turkish foreign minister, Mr. Hakan. So he's receiving diplomats and dignitaries of the highest order. So for sure,
so the West is ahead of the. I mean, these people are ahead of the curve here. You mentioned Turkey, you mentioned Qatar, you mentioned Jordan, and there have been some links with the Americans apparently, but the West is behind here, isn't it? It's not openly acknowledging him. I know that America's dropped the big bounty they had on his head.
The $10 million has been dropped. Yes.
Yeah, which is, I guess, something. But they're holding back, aren't they? The West. They're not giving diplomatic acknowledgement to him yet. Are they still waiting to see what kind of person he will be? Because I mean, the HTS group now in charge had links to Al Qaeda, which obviously is an enemy of the West. So, is that still a cause for concern, do you think?
Again, a couple of things there. So, US diplomats have already been meeting Mr. Shara.
Right.
And HTS officials. I mean, the US embassy in Syria confirmed this 2 days ago, that representatives from the US embassy in Syria, had met with HTS officials to talk about a smooth transitional handover with protection of minorities and so forth, the usual stuff which Western governments demand or expect.
Somewhat ironically, considering how they treat minorities.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and
that's another subject, but yeah.
And also contribute towards the destabilization of the said countries that you're now asking for, So anyway, putting that aside, they have already been meeting, and it was born from that meeting that the bounty would be dropped. Now, why is the US holding back? A very interesting question. Now, what we may see is a recognition of the political wing. Also, we don't know if the HTS group's going to dissolve. If it forms the next government, there may not be the need of Hayat Tahrir Sham as at least as an armed group, because it would be basically forming or leading the next government. Most of their fighters would make up the Syrian National Army, which is also in talks. So the future of HTS we don't know, but we could see a similar situation whereby the West will not prescribe its political bureau and its political wing, like we saw with Hamas, but have a prescription on its armed or military wing, like we saw with Hamas as well, with Al-Qassam brigades. Similarly with Hezbollah previously, the armed faction was banned, but not the political faction. So we may see a similar approach by the US. Why? Because the US and the West, the UN and all these international bodies always would like the option to slap on a prescription if and when it aligns with their respective policies in the region. So I don't think an entirely lift on the prescription is in the horizon. It could be, but I don't think it will. But I think there'll be a lift in the political wing of HTS and probably not the armed wing. But then again, we don't know what the future of the group is. But the American officials have met the transitional government officials, and they're receiving pretty much all the big key players. I know there's a line of comms open even with Russia. And even this conversation, and even what is the future of Russian bases in Tartus? Should they remain? Is there a strategic benefit? Then there's the other side who are basically saying, how could we possibly have Russians who decimate our country and kill so many of our people for 6 years? Or 6 straight years? How does that make sense? So all of these conversations are happening. The question I guess many will be wondering is the timing of the attack. How quick and swift it was, and how quickly key players have been in receiving and normalizing relations with the HTS-led transitional government.
Well, on that very point, what happened to the Syrian army? I mean, there's an army in that country, and apparently, did they just give up? I mean, what happened to them? There was very little resistance to the HTS takeover of the country. So this looks suspicious. Why did it happen so quickly and without any apparent it wasn't a civil war particularly. It was just one day it was Assad, the next day he'd more or less gone, and we have a new bunch of rulers. So what happened there so quickly?
So these are the very same questions I posited to both Obeida Arnaut, the official spokesman of the transitional government and the head of the political bureau. And it's also the exact same questions I posited to Yasser Al-Jundi, who's a military expert and a war studies expert and a military scientist. And basically they said, look, we have been preparing for 4 or 5 years.
Well, HTS, I mean.
HTS and all the other groups, primarily HTS, but all the other groups that then later fell under their umbrella and their sphere of control. They said, we've been preparing for 4 or 5 years. We've learned so many lessons. We learned the lessons of the first 2 years, where we managed to gain 60% of Syria. And then we learned the lessons from the infighting and the guerrilla warfare and the urban warfare and the hybrid warfare of fighting Iranian militias and Hezbollah and Russia in the sky and so forth. We've learned so much from what we had gained in the past and what we had lost in the past.
Right.
And we used all that knowledge to basically learn, develop, avoid mistakes and military errors. At the same time, they've been producing domestically manufactured hybrid weaponry like the Shaheen drones, the UAVs, artificial intelligence-based weaponry, communication scrammers. This is something that they've been working on for 5 years. Of course, we want to know this when the initial operation began, but now it is coming out. They've been training, they've been preparing for 4 or 5 years. I mean, in Idlib, where HTS essentially control, where they have the Syrian Salvation Authority, it is a very developed and fully functioning little enclave of an Islamic society in Idlib.
They've got experience of governance already in this regional area of Syria. They're not like guys from nowhere. Oh,
no. But also keep in mind that Idlib barely makes 10% of Syria. So controlling Idlib under the Syrian Salvation Army, where it's entirely HTS, is very different to now governing the entirety of Syria, which has a sizable Alawite community, which has a sizable Christian community, which has a sizable Druze community, and Shia community, and so forth. Even though Sunnis make up the majority, there are sizable minorities, ethnic and religious, and therefore it's not the same as governing Idlib. But the point is, they've been training for 4 or 5 years. They've learned from their mistakes. They've learned from the strengths and weaknesses of Hezbollah and the Iranian militias. And they also made no secret of the timing of the attack. They said, we absolutely did it when Hezbollah was weakened by Israel a day after the ceasefire was signed. We absolutely did it when Russia was stretched out in Ukraine. We absolutely did it when the Iranians had been given a bloody nose from Israel. And we timed our attack then, because the Syrian people and the Syrian revolutionaries don't see the axis of resistance as others do. They see them as the axis of oppression.
Wow.
And I know that may be hard for some to swallow, but the vast majority of Syrians, and not just Sunni Muslims, see Iran, Hezbollah, Russia as perpetrators of oppression who propped up and protected and safeguarded the Assad regime. Now, you ask what happened to the Syrian Arab army. Well, the answer is there. The Syrian Arab army relied very significantly on Russian air power, on Iranian Hezbollah guerrilla warfare knowledge, and generally their drive to fight. The Syrian Arab army was bankrupt morally. It didn't understand what it was fighting for, who it was fighting for, and for what end. Whereas the Syrian rebels, on the other hand, were more determined, more prepared, more trained, as well as having sleeper cells in many of these cities. They had active sleeper cells in Homs and in Hama and in Halab. And the initial plan was for the revolutionaries led by HTS to just take Aleppo. But when Aleppo pretty much fell without a fight, they moved on to Homs. Now, in Homs, there was a little fight, there were some airstrikes, but that pretty much also fell without a significant fight or the fight that they were expecting. And at that point, once you've got Homs, you've basically strangled Damascus. And you're now threatening the very land route that Iran enjoys through Syria directly into Lebanon. And people said, if Homs falls, Damascus is only a matter of time. And literally, Paul, I'm getting updates from on the ground. I'm posting it. I've gone for dinner or salah. I've come back and something else has happened. And it's moving at such an... And we must also forget that why didn't the Syrian regime and its Russian allies and Iranian allies respond the way they have been? Is because it simply wasn't ready for the mobilization. They weren't ready from the grassroots uprising when people became aware of what was happening coming from the north. The southern rebels rose up. And now it became infectious. Parts of the country where they didn't even have armed militias or armed rebel groups were uprising. So it all happened very fast, very quick. The Syrian Arab army was overwhelmed. Russia and Iran basically said, if the Syrian Arab army are not going to fight for their country, then why are we going to sacrifice our men? And Hezbollah was simply just stretched out. So that's, as they say, that's the story in Balamori. It happened very quick and it happened very fast. And there are legitimate reasons as to the success behind it. But the critics, the detractors, will say there was a Turkish hand. There was an American hand somewhere. Now,
there was a Turkish hand because they were quite open about it. It wasn't hidden. I mean, they were quite clear that they were supporting HTS.
Absolutely. But if you're talking about an actual Turkish hand in terms of weaponry, funding, and intelligence gathering and sharing, sure, that may be the case with the Syrian National Army, because that's the Turkish horse in the Syrian fight. They are basically the Syrian National Army that basically mans and protects and oversees the buffer zone between Turkey and the Kurdish areas. Right. So yes, they would have received Turkish funding and weaponry and intelligence, no doubt, but they were very much a part of Operation Deterring Aggression. But if we're talking about Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, did they receive Turkish money or funding or weapons or intelligence or American or any foreign? That's yet to be proven. If you want to say that there was a Turkish hand involved, absolutely, via the Syrian National Army. And there was even a UAE and Jordanian hand within the southern rebels that were coming up from Deraa. But HTS have consistently maintained that Operation Deterring Aggression was entirely grassroots, led by Syrians, led by the sons of this nation, assisted by the foreign fighters and the Muhajirin who had basically migrated to Syria many years ago.
Yeah, no, gosh. Now, we've touched on this briefly, but the new administration is promising an ethnically and religiously diverse Syria. It's such an important question. Are there any signs, though, that this will indeed happen, or is this just political slogan? I mean, is the government going to be representative of all of Syria? Is it going to behave with justice towards everyone? In other words, it's not going to oppress certain minorities. And I'm not talking about, is it going to become a Western secular democracy? That's not what I'm asking. Is it going to represent all the people of Syria? If it says it is, but I think it might be saying this, is this to be believed? Are we seeing this actually happening on the ground, do you think?
I don't think any other model would work in the Levant. It just simply wouldn't work because of for how long it's been a crossroads of civilization and a melting point of humanity. You simply cannot have one single order without some representation by the religious and ethnic minorities that existed. And that's why successive Islamic caliphates and sultanates and polities understood this very hybrid sensitivity, sensitive nature and demographic makeup of the Levant. What is interesting is that the sectarian government and regime of Bashar al-Assad is the one that was planted there. The Alawites were planted there by the French colonialists. For 8% of a country to rule over 80% majority of Sunni Muslims was always going to be a recipe for disaster. It was designed by intention to ensure that no Sunni revolutionary forces or anti-Western forces ever assume power. So we have to understand that reality. Now, in terms of what's being said from the transitional government, is that they're going to have a representative government. They are going to have elections at some point sooner or later. And key groups like the Druze, like the Christians, we are yet to hear from any positive developments from the Kurdish-held areas where they are still holding out, the PKK and the YPG, American-funded, People want to talk about American funded. Well, let's talk about the Kurds. The Kurds are American funded.
There's a war going on in Syria, isn't it?
There is, yes. In the east, in the east of so as it stands now, the transitional government controls around 80 to 85% of Syria. The 15% that's kind of being held out is predominantly being held by the Kurds, and of course those areas that have been occupied by Israel, old and new. So that's where we're at. Now back to this whole representation thing. Now, what was interesting was that in at least some conversations with officials, they were suggesting that could a modern millet system work, like the Ottomans used to have, right? So I'm sure you followed Jeremy Bowen's interview with Ahmed al-Shara, where he asked him about alcohol and women's clothing.
Really pressing matters facing Syria. Well, yes. Are you going to have alcohol? And
it always boils down to, sadly, I mean, I don't mean to take a shot at your ethnic tribe, Paul. But for some reason,
about you. That's what I mean. But I don't mean to be racist, but here we go. Okay.
Yeah, but
take your best shot, Dilly. Take your best shot.
Women, girls, and alcohol. That's it's a common.
There is a weakness in that area. Yes, this is true.
Let's forget about the 600,000 kids. Let's forget about the 12 billion displaced. Let's forget about
the question. It was like so Middle England, as if he was chatting to the vicar down the road.
Honestly.
Well, are you going to ban alcohol in your parish? Excuse me, this is not Middle England. This is Syria.
Honestly,
it's just a catastrophe. Please get the issues here.
But obviously, Jeremy Bowen and others are asking about these questions, whether it's alcohol or the celebration of Christmas or Christmas trees coming up in many of these cities, is because there is a sizable Christian minority in Syria. They've been there. They're as old as Islam. They're older than Islam. Some of them have been there before the Muslims came. So, and they've maintained their religion there. They've preserved their religion there, their lineage, their structures, their churches. And that's because of the justice of Islam and the tolerance of Islam to Ahl al-Kitab and Dhimmis. Now, even though this is not a caliphate or an emirate or sultanate, and I don't think they'll be collecting jizya from them, but there is a conversation happening that, look, what was the last system of governance that worked in this region? It was the Ottoman millet system.
The Islamic system.
So just to elaborate a little bit for your viewers and listeners, the millet system is actually grounded on the Sunnah. It is actually grounded upon the earlier khulafa, who basically allowed.
The Sunnah is the practice, the approvals, the disapprovals of Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace.
Yes. Yeah. So the Christians, if you want to drink alcohol and produce alcohol and distill wine, you do it in your respective areas and quarters. Right? Don't bring it over to communal areas, and certainly not the Muslim majority areas. If Jews want to do X, Y, and Z, you have your respective quarters and areas and regions and towns and villages which you can go and do what you need to do. Just don't bring it into communal areas, or especially Muslim majority areas. Not only that, you can rule and govern, at least according to your civil matters, to your own laws and customs and traditions. And if you are not happy,
this, by the way, is genuine pluralism in the West.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Germany, Britain. We don't actually have pluralism. It's nothing like as advanced as the Muslim system, which is really pluralist and tolerant in a way that most Westerners cannot even conceive of. When people talk about what one law fits everyone, one universal set of laws, one size fits all, this is much more advanced and much more respecting of diversity and difference. And yet, this is the ancient Sharia system. The millet system, which, as it was known in the Ottoman period, which went on for centuries, where Christians, can you drink alcohol under Sharia law? You can if you're a Christian, if you're an Islamic society, you're allowed to. In fact, your legal rights are protected in that regard. It's quite extraordinary.
Absolutely. And it's not just a system that was just there at a certain episode or blip in history. It lasted for centuries. The Ottomans had this system in the Balkans, they had in the Levant, and previous polities, Islamic polities, also had their own version of the millet system. So ultimately what it is religious minorities under an Islamic government or country or nation or state being able to govern and live according to their own urf, traditions and customs in their respective areas, whilst respecting the law of the country of being able to have the freedom to practice and arbitrate amongst themselves. They also have the option to refer back to the central government if they are not happy with their self-arbitration. Now, that is the conversation that's taking place in Syria. Now, how would that look in a modern nation state is the question. How would this happen in accordance or in alignment with elections? Should there be proportionate representation? So whatever demographic makeup of Druze and Christians and Alawites and Shia, should that same proportion be represented in government? So these are all these different types of conversations taking place. And the very fact that there are Christmas trees in Aleppo, bars are still open in some neighborhoods and some parts of Damascus, shows that there is, at least to begin with, a clear show of tolerance to the practices and the cultural norms of non-Muslim Syrians.
Right. So that's interesting. Okay, let's change tack, if we may.
Sure.
Let's talk about Israel. Now, Israel is continuing, as far as I can see, its ongoing attacks in Syria, its aggression, bombings, and so on, all sorts of things. But the response of the interim rulers, the administration, the governance in Syria seems to be quite muted, even silent about this, which is odd when your country is being attacked by a foreign power. Why this apparent inaction? What's going on there? Why are they not speaking out against this incursion? The United Nations has condemned it, but they don't seem to, the HTS don't seem to be speaking out very vocally about this. Why might that be?
Absolutely, and I echo those frustrations. It was why I asked Ahmed al-Shara, one of the questions I asked him was that, look, Israel is attacking Syria as we speak. Why the delay in acknowledging and the inaction? And to kind of quote him, he said, look, we are aware of what is happening. Our priority right now is for national unity, is to consolidate the land that has been taken as a result of the Assad regime toppling. We still have not, the entire country has not been swept. There are still places where Assad loyalists and Kurdish factions are embedded and entrenched. We need to unify the Syrian people. We've just toppled a brutal dictator after 13 years of bloody war. We have mass graves being found, prisons underground. We're having hundreds of thousands of Syrians returning. Fighting Israel is simply not a priority right now. This is what we're managing. This is what we're dealing with. And it's actually one of the understandable outcomes of toppling a regime in 12 days, that they themselves were not prepared for what was going to follow thereafter. Now, Israel started bombing straight away. As soon as Assad was toppled, they went into the Golan Heights. They made further incursions. They took Mount Hermon, already started making jokes about making it a skiing site and so forth, as genocidal Zionist settlers do. Israel is believed to be just 22 kilometers south of Damascus, next to Daraa. They've already been shooting Syrian protesters. So I posited all of this. They are aware of it, but the kind of delay in even acknowledging it took them nearly a week to even comment on it publicly. And then obviously appealing to the international community to ensure that Israel abides by international law. And we all know from the last 14 months of the Gaza genocide, what that means and whether that could ever be implemented. And they would, or that they even give two rats about international human rights and international law. So my understanding from what Mr. Shara and Mr. Arnaut said to me is that, look, we simply don't have the capacity or the appetite to prioritize a war with Israel, because we know what that would entail. Right now, our priority is to secure the land and the borders that we've got under our control, bring unification, and basically bring stability to this country, understanding that hundreds and thousands of people, of Syrians, will be returning. What are they returning to? They're returning to rubble. So the footage and the daily footage that we're seeing of the scenery in Gaza, 60-70% of Syria already looks like that. It's decimated. It's in rubble. So what are people returning to? So we've got an issue of logistics. We've got an issue of security. We've got an issue of resources. All of this happening, and there's an expectation to go to a full-out war with Israel. That's what they're basically saying, that they simply doesn't fit into our priorities. Now, that said, could the words of condemnation be stronger? Could the warnings to Israel be stronger, more unequivocal? Absolutely. It was one of the things which I had hoped to have seen from my interactions from the leadership. But do they acknowledge what's happening? Absolutely. It's hard to ignore it when it's happening literally at your doorstep. Do they want to do something about it? They do. Naturally, any country would want to do something about their territorial integrity. But is it a priority for them right now, given the multitude and the multifaceted challenges that they have at hand? They would say no. And I guess what the Ummah wants to basically see is two things. Number one, a bit more vocal solidarity with what's happening with the Palestinians, given that the Israelis are now bombing Syria. And number two, at least at the very least, have more of a stronger approach to Israeli encroachment to Syrian territory. Because if the critics and the detractors and the haters of the Syrian revolution and revolutionaries are basically saying that this entire thing is a US-led NATO plot, then such a weak stance towards Israel sadly perpetuates and feeds into that conspiracy or that suspicion. So it is something that I would like to see from the transitional government, more unequivocal action towards Israel, and appeal to brother nations to help and assist in protecting this very new government at such a nascent stage. Me, you, and the whole Ummah wants to see more from every Muslim government towards Palestine and Israel. But they also did say that we find it strange that the Ummah is expecting from us, or at least some pockets within the Ummah are expecting from us in 12 days what Arab regimes have not done in 60 years. So all these things have to be factored in. I would like to see and hear a lot more against Israel, because we know that Israel is neither stopping nor slowing down. And
no, it seems to be militarily completely victorious and triumphant at the moment. In the Middle East, completely. It's a horrible thing to have.
Absolutely. But
it's completely unassailable, and because it has America's back and the whole West's back, basically.
But
Ireland, I suppose. But I mean, and it's quite shocking. The supremacists now, and they're just getting away with murder, literally, all the time, every day, doing what the hell they want.
There is a very important nuance that I would like viewers and listeners, supporters and critics and neutrals of the Syrian revolution and the Arab Spring in general to ponder on this, right? If we concede to the point that Bashar al-Assad, under the axis of resistance led by Iran, was the only credible opposition and resistance to the Zionist agenda in the region, then why is it that, knowing that the Bashar al-Assad regime had those weapon stockpiles, had those chemical weapons, had the naval fleet and so forth, how come Israel never attacked Bashar al-Assad and the 80% of the military capabilities whilst he was in power? How come Iran and Hezbollah's presence and land route in Syria didn't prevent the genocide in Gaza? So I do believe that there is a time to at least now review and look towards new emerging axes of resistances, one that may not involve or be led by Iran, or one that may broadly incorporate Iran if it is able to get away from, move away from its sectarian agenda and its more kind of and its hegemonic intentions. I don't know. This is a new chapter. If these HTS guys were allies and stooges of the West, why would Israel be bombing this new government's military capabilities? It didn't bomb it whilst Assad was in power. It wasn't. It left all those stockpiles. It left all those weaponries whilst Assad's rule. So how much of a resistance was he actually putting up to the Zionists? Why is it that as soon as Sunni Islamists take over a transitional government and take over Syria, why all of a sudden is the entire country's strategic heavy weaponry and armament being taken out? So these are all questions to ask. We can argue on the one hand that all of this fits into the greater Israel project and the NATO agenda for the region and so forth and all that, but we can also counter it the other way. That if HTS and the Syrian rebels were truly allies of the West and stooges and agents of the West, then we wouldn't be seeing Israel doing what it's doing. We wouldn't be seeing such, even though things have been happening very fast, but still a reluctance from the US to basically lift the ban and say that, yeah, we absolutely recognize this.
The sanctions as well, which have been...
And the sanctions is one of the key things. The sanctions is one of the key contributors behind why the people of Syria are not going to be able to move forward and progress, at least from a socioeconomic point of view. So all these questions have to be asked, and I'm as curious about the timing and the involvement of external players in all of this as I am about why Israel chose to leave all these weaponries and all these strategic locations unharmed during the Assad regime's rule.
Yeah, indeed. So talking about Iran, I mean, how does the toppling of Assad and by extension the weakening of Iran impact the Palestinian cause, which is the central issue really here?
It follows perfectly onto what we were just talking about. So no doubt Iran has been dealt a severe blow or blows over the course of last 3-4 months. Hassan Nasrallah, the iconic leader of the Lebanese Shia resistance group, Hezbollah, was pretty much, many would argue, was the spinal cord of the axis of resistance. We had the beeper attack, the pager attack. We had multiple successive leaders of Hezbollah assassinated. We had the president of Iran dying in a suspicious plane crash. Yahya Sinwar has been assassinated. Ismail Haniyeh has been assassinated. Many of the key figures of those who fronted this movement are now gone. But I think the fall of the Assad regime was the biggest blow. It is the biggest blow to Iran because Hezbollah is still present in Lebanon and they're still arguably very well armed. Hamas, even though it's questionable as to how many of them have been killed and how many of their tunnel structures have been destroyed, they are still fighting Israel, because Israel isn't actually fighting a conventional face-to-face war. They're fighting urban warfare and basically bombing and decimating from the skies. They're not actually meeting Hamas fighters as regularly as they claim to be. But Syria is gone now. Assad is gone. That land route is no longer there. That land route which would allow Iranian weaponry and reinforcements to go into Syria, remain in Syria, and also cross over to Lebanon via Quintera, that is no longer there. So that is a severe blow to one of the key arteries of the axis of resistance. But let's make no mistake, Iran is still a regional power. It is still a force to be reckoned with because of its habit and policy of self-sufficiency as a result of sanctions. So Iran is very much still a key player in the region, but it has been given a severe blow by the toppling of the Assad regime. And now I believe it has to ask some truly existential and self-reflective questions. Did we back Bashar al-Assad for too long? Was there a time and opportunity where we could have made a deal and listened to the people of Syria? Now, the mistake Iran made in Syria is very much the same mistake India made in Bangladesh, in the sense that India banked on the Hasina regime and the Awami League party, not the people of Bangladesh. Iran banked on the Assad regime and not the people of Syria. When you bank on regimes and specific political parties, your relationship with the said country, if that regime is toppled, is not going to be a good one, because people won't forget that you went all in on a brutal dictatorial regime that ruled with an iron fist and has the blood of hundreds and thousands of their hands. They won't forget that. Syrians will not forget that. So Iran has to really ask these questions: that how, moving forward now, how do we rebuild relations with our neighbors, our Arab nations, our Sunni Arab nations, with Syria, with Turkey? These are questions that Iran has to be asking, because it's gone from a serious player with tentacles of actual influence in what was called the Persian Crescent, from Yemen to Bahrain to Lebanon to Iraq to Syria, creating this huge buffer between itself and its enemies in every surrounding, is no longer there and has been severely weakened by Assad. So Iran needs to be asking itself some serious questions with regards to how it sees itself in the region and how it moves forward, and how forgiving the Syrians will be in allowing any future kind of involvement of Iran in the policies of Syria, which it absolutely should not have, but it did enjoy that under Assad. It enjoyed that under Assad. They propped up and kept up the Assad regime. They had a hand in the blood and the death and destruction, and this is now something which is going to backfire on them. There could be even domestic uprisings and upheaval and opposition, people saying, how much did we spend on Bashar al-Assad, how much did we invest in the Syrian war, when that money and those resources could have been invested into the Iranian people and our development and our safety and security. But the Iranian government, led by the revolutionary Khomeini government, will obviously say that the defense and the preservation of Assad is a defense and preservation of Iran, because it sees, some people say proxies, but some people say allies, wherever you want to term it, it sees those surrounding nations as a protective measure from land invasions and even air invasions.
Well, you mentioned Bangladesh there briefly. So how does the Syria revolution differ from Bangladesh's revolution, which happened recently, or even the liberation of Afghanistan in 2021?
They all have similarities and they all have very distinct differences. So let's talk about Bangladesh's revolution very quickly. I know there's an episode I did with you, mashallah, so people can go back to that, inshallah. Bangladesh's revolution was comparatively non-violent to the Syrians. Of course, there was violence. 2,000 people were killed. Thousands more were injured by police and plainclothes thugs of the Hasina regime. There was violence, but it didn't erupt into an armed insurrection. It didn't become a civil war in some periods of the conflict. Hasina, while she ruled for 15 years, she was toppled in 6 weeks. The Syrian revolution lasted for 13 years, and Bashar al-Assad was toppled in 12 days. So there are those distinct differences. Bangladesh revolution did not have external players involved. Of course, we had the influence of Indian raw agencies and security services involved, but there wasn't any official involvement of foreign players in Bangladesh, whereas in Syria we had Hezbollah, we had Iran, we had mercenaries from Afghanistan and Pakistan, we had the Turks helping the Syrian National Army, we had many external players fighting and present on the ground in Syria, and that was the case very early on. Bangladesh wasn't the case there. The revolution in Syria was led unequivocally, unashamedly, by a group that defines itself as an Islamic group. Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, Islamist, Islamic, whatever you want to call them. They make no secret about their desire, at least before, when they were Jaish al-Fatah al-Sham and al-Nusra, that they want an Islamic state, they want an Islamic government, they want to rule by Sharia law. These are things which the previous versions of this group had made clear. And up until very recently, 2019, 2020, 2021, there was no kind of secret about the kind of Islamicness of the said group. Now, compare that to Bangladesh, the students were of different backgrounds. They were secular, they were left-leaning, they were practicing, they were Islamic. You had Maoists, you had feminists as part of the uprising, the student-led uprising in Bangladesh. So that certainly was not the case in Syria. So those are those differences. But the similarities are that Bashar al-Assad and Sheikh Hasina both governed their respective countries as if it was their father's private property. They assumed power after their fathers. So in the case of Hasina, it was Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. In the case of Bashar al-Assad, it was Hafiz al-Assad. They assumed power and control over their father's political parties and movements, and they ruled with an iron fist, with the blood of thousands on their hand. Assad obviously way more than Hasina, but if Hasina was given that opportunity, I'm very sure that she would have killed equally as many people just to preserve her throne. And that is the nature of Taghut, that's the nature of oppressors and the Zalimun, that they will fight teeth and nail to preserve their regime, but they will also flee like cowards when it comes to when they realize that their regimes are about to topple and they have to face accountability and justice to their people. So there are those similarities, but there are also those very distinct differences between Bangladesh and Syria. Primarily that external players were not officially involved in one and were involved in the other, and the very overt Islamic identity and undercurrents of the Syrian revolution, which wasn't necessarily there with the Bangladesh revolution. It was there, but it was there amongst other things, and it didn't necessarily stand out. The Taliban takeover of 2021, or as the Afghans now describe it as their liberation, that has similarities. That has similarities in terms of Operation Deterring Aggression, which was done in 12 days. And basically the Taliban pretty much took control of most of Afghanistan within the space of 6 weeks. Now 6 weeks to 12 days, I know is still a huge kind of like a time difference, but the kind of rapid nature in which the Taliban were taking provinces and cities without firing a single bullet, promising general amnesty, trying to convince their people that, look, occupation is not good. We have to get rid of America and NATO and their stooges, and promising general amnesty, and not that much bloodshed was involved. At least what they thought was going to be involved in the taking of Afghanistan has a lot of similarities to the way the Syrian revolutionaries, led by HTS, carried out Operation Deterring Aggression, which is general amnesty. We don't want to fight. You're surrounded. You're in a weak position, and we need to liberate our country. of Russian, Iranian, Hezbollah forces and toppling the Assad regime. So they have similarities in that regard. I'm sure you had seen the video of the spokesman for the Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Abdul Kahar Balki, congratulating Obaida Arnout via a FaceTime call. So there is definitely a brotherly understanding and brotherly relations that, their struggle, their resistance was something that was grounded upon Islam, or at least according to them, they believe it was according to Islam, with a vision of Islam, but two very different and distinct realities. Ahmed al-Shara said in the interview with Jeremy Bowen that Syria is not Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a very tribal society. Syria is not. So therefore, things like women's education and girls' education, there'll be difference in approaches. And so, there are those similarities, but there are those distinct differences. Afghanistan, Syria, and Bangladesh, three countries that have experienced seismic political changes in the last 3 years. In the case of Bangladesh and Syria in the last couple of months, alhamdulillah, I've been blessed and honored to visit all those three countries. There are similarities in terms of the oppression and the injustice and the interference and meddling of external players, directly or indirectly, but there are also very distinct differences with regards to how each revolution or uprising or occupation played out.
Okay, I mean, just the next question, really, my penultimate question is about a tweet that you put up on X. Very interesting and shocking initially. You said Egypt's Sisi could be next, and he knows it. I mean, I know this is a tweet, so I'm not going to, this is not meant to be a PhD dissertation, but what's going on there? I mean, do you know something the rest of us don't?
No, not at all. I just think that the way in which uprisings and revolutions happen in the Middle East and North Africa and the Arab world is infectious. The same tweet could apply to King Abdullah in Jordan, because there's one thing, the US trying to protect their interests via their respective stooges and agents, but you can't necessarily control the desire of the Muslims of that region to not live under tyranny and injustice. There's this whole kind of what's the word I'm going to? It's not skeptic. There's this skepticism to the Arab Spring that many have.
This is what I've been thinking, because the Arab Spring was a huge catastrophe. What happened to it ultimately, and so that's still on many people's minds.
It is in many people.
We tried that and it failed. So,
but who said it was over? I don't think it was necessarily over. And Syria it wasn't over in Syria. And it may not be over in Egypt, and it may not be over in many places. We simply don't know. Just because many closed the chapter of the Arab Spring doesn't necessarily mean that it was ever over. In fact, if anything, the Arab Spring proved to the masses of that region that regimes and rulers and dictators can be removed. But what are the lessons that we can learn from Libya, from Egypt, from Tunisia, from Yemen, from Syria, from Bahrain, and any other country that was affected by it? There were lessons to be learned. The main one being that you can get rid of a regime, or you can get rid of a dictator. That doesn't necessarily mean the dictatorial deep state is gone, or that the very oppressive nature of the regime, the remnants of it, remains very much still there, and all you end up doing is a cosmetic change. Or in the case of Egypt and Mohammed Morsi, rahimahullah, may Allah have mercy on him, I mean, is that, can the military actually be trusted? All these kind of questions and lessons should be learnt from 2011 and 12 and 13. And Syria gives the longest lessons of them all, because it lasted and its revolution succeeded. If the aim of the revolution, when it began in 2011 in Daraa, after the killing, the abduction of Hamza al-Khatib, then the objectives of the revolution has succeeded. If the aim was to topple the Assad regime and not live under a brutal Alawite regime that brutalized not just Muslims but non-Muslims who didn't fall in line with his policies and ever posed any remote threat to his power, then they've succeeded. What have we learned from the Syrian experience is the same question we should be asking about what we learned from the Egyptian experience. Now, what do I mean by Egypt could be next and Sisi knows it? It's because there have been some movements, some small pockets of protests taking place in Egypt. We've also seen that Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is one of the very few neighboring Arab rulers that is yet to even comment on the success of the Syrian revolution. Yeah, the Qataris have, the Saudis have, the Jordanians have, the Turks have. Why is Egypt so quiet? How come?
So you can see why they might be reluctant to acknowledge
Yes,
it.
I mean, if you see, if the Egyptians now see Abdel Fattah el-Sisi cozying up to an Islamist revolutionary in Syria, that could trigger that could trigger, or that could inspire the revolutionaries in his own ranks, in his own country. So there is that question surrounding what is Egypt's position moving forward? Why is there this hesitancy and this delay in commenting or congratulating or taking any position on the Syrian revolution and the successes, and that there have been news and reports of small pockets of protests taking place across Egypt?
I mean, even when I was there in Egypt a year and a half ago, there were small pockets of protests. I mean, that's not unprecedented. But if they got renewed vigor because of what's happening in Syria, of course, that could be quite worrying for the authorities. But I didn't realize they hadn't commented on what the developments in Syria. That's interesting. I suppose for them, it's a huge dilemma.
I mean, Sisi did actually. I lie. Sisi did say one thing. He said, unlike the Syrian regime, i.e., referring to Assad, we don't kill innocent people and have blood on our hands.
Oh, I remember that. Yes, that was met with somewhat derision on TikTok and Twitter. I remember. Yeah.
Can you imagine?
Great irony. But perhaps moving on is something that really does perplex me even more. And there are many supporters of the Palestinians on the left in the UK. Some very noble examples hitherto, people like George Galloway, Craig Murray and Miller and so on. But they turned out recently, and this is what I really don't understand, to be quite ardent supporters of the Assad and Russia. Yeah. And I really didn't see that coming. It's odd sort of listening to Galloway sing a very different tune all of a sudden. What on earth's going there? Why are these people suddenly coming out of the closet and supporting Russia and Assad all of a sudden?
So, yeah, I mean, those names that you mentioned and those who kind of fall within that ideological camp are basically essentially they're socialists and they're communists and they're kind of from the hard left, and therefore they're blind spot and they have a soft spot for Russia and its imperialism, or China and its imperialism. And basically they live and exist in a very binary ideological world where you have the NATO-led imperialists and the anti-imperialists that make up Russia, China, North Korea, all their favorite Arab dictators. And that's where they kind of align themselves with. It was very unfortunate to see from the likes of Galloway. Even though with Galloway, people shouldn't be surprised. He's someone who rejects and denies unequivocally the Uyghur ethnic cleansing and the ethnic genocide that's taking place, the cultural genocide that's taking place with the Uyghur Muslims in occupied East Turkestan, or known as Xinjiang. He has always supported Bashar al-Assad. He has always made excuses for Putin. Yeah. This is so Galloway wasn't the secret. I don't think people are surprised.
I selectively tune into him.
Yeah. But Professor David Miller and Craig Murray for sure have been a shock to some. I think in a podcast with me, there was a clip that went viral where David Miller told Syrians to get over it. He told the Syrians, predominantly the Muslims who were killed in Syria, to basically just get over it. And I left that part in, and I'm giving you a little exclusive here. I purposely left that part in, even though I got slated for that podcast by some pockets of the Sunni Muslim community.
Yeah, I noticed.
And rightfully so. I accept that. But just so everyone knows, I purposely left that bit in. I could have easily taken it out. But had I taken it out, you would have never known that this was the position of David Miller. And that's how he sees the sanctity or the lack of it of Syrian life. Craig Murray, all of a sudden going from being very pro-Palestine and pro-resistance to now all of a sudden encouraging people to report to the police anyone who appears to support Syrian revolutionaries because HTS is a banned terrorist organization. I mean, parroting the exact kind of ideological talking points, the dehumanization, the Islamophobia, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, head choppers, black flags, all of this, the same language that Zionists and the very imperialists that they claim to oppose, all of a sudden now they're just chiming from the same book, resorting to the same dog whistle, resorting to the very same language of caricaturing and taking away the agency of what the Syrian people have wanted and achieved. So George Galloway wasn't a surprise. David Miller was a surprise to many, and I think he has basically damaged his relationship with many Muslim organizations and communities, because it wasn't that long ago that he had that very landmark case, the employment tribunal case, which will go down as a legal litmus test for anyone who now is pursued or discriminated in the workplace for having anti-Zionist views. David Miller contributed towards that, and it's a landmark case, and it will no doubt help Muslims and non-Muslims who espouse anti-Zionist views. But it is shocking and disappointing and even worrying, actually, that how quickly the mask fell, and how quickly the language and the tactics of the imperialists was adopted by the very anti-imperialists in putting down anyone who supported the Syrian revolutionaries. Anyone who supports the Syrian revolution is a supporter of Al-Qaeda, or is a supporter of ISIS head choppers, or is a NATO agent. And in your case, you've been accused of something as well very recently as a result of your recent interview. I've been accused of being an MI6 agent for basically just being able to access Syria and be able to speak to the leadership, like every other member of the press that's been trying to do the same thing. So you're seeing this very irrational, this very unhinged approach by some of the people that you've mentioned and others that fall broadly within that camp, in basically not understanding that the Syrian people do not see Iran and Russia and Hezbollah the way that they see them. That they in fact see them as occupiers and oppressors and killers of their brothers, sisters and tribesmen. And the bigger, look, you could articulate and frame arguments in a way in which you're not speaking at the Muslims. You're not telling Muslims what they should believe or not believe, because that's what David Miller's been doing. David Miller has basically been telling people that if you really want a resistance or an Islamic revival, you should be following the kind of revolutionary theology of the 1979 revolution and blah, 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 blah. Excuse me, mate. Calm down. Chill out. You
stay in your lane, I would say.
Literally just stay in your lane.
Stop telling Muslims what they should think about.
Exactly. Stop. And how is that any different to any neocon Zionist imperialist that tells Muslims what is radical and what is tolerant and what is mainstream? It's the same playbook. So I think Muslims in vast numbers have woken up and thought, wow, is Craig Murray was like that? David Miller's like that? Okay, we thought that maybe Gaza would have calmed them down, that maybe Gaza would have instilled some humanity in them, that they wouldn't differentiate between the genocide in Gaza and the genocide in Syria, right? So that comes as no surprise, because communists, socialists, leftists also have a tendency and a bloodlust for Muslims and occupying their lands. We've seen that throughout the Cold War. We've seen that in Chechnya and in Dagestan. We've seen that in Syria. We've seen that in many parts of other parts of the world, which are not necessarily occupied and destabilized by Western powers. So it seems to be one rule for the NATO imperialists, who absolutely cannot be trusted, Israel and Zionists, who cannot be trusted, but similarly, nor can Russia, nor can China, nor can these countries. So they force people into a binary, and because they've enjoyed support by Muslims over the issue of Palestine, they assume that support would transfer over to Syria, and he absolutely didn't. And as one brother said, that Syria will be a litmus test. It will be a litmus test for the Muslims to understand that how can, on the one hand, so much passion and hard work and advocacy and activism can be given for the cause of Palestine and Gaza, but on the issue of Syria, the same people will literally justify genocide, will literally justify air bombing and the decimation of entire cities and war crimes and chemical attacks. How can there be such a huge disparity in a region where the Palestinians and the Syrians are cousins themselves? They're Levantine cousins. Some of them share tribes and come from the same tribes and lineage. How could there be such an unequivocal and diametric opposition and juxtaposition between support for Palestine from these guys and completely backing a brutal dictator like Assad on the other? They completely take away the agency of the Muslims to not be fit into or forced into either this pro-American NATO-led imperialism or this kind of leftist, tanky, tin pot foil kind of anti-imperialist agenda led by Russia, China, Iran, and etc. and so forth. We don't have to fall into either.
No,
we don't have to fall into either. You can say that both have blood on their hands. You can even make a measured argument that one is more responsible for the death and destruction of Muslims than the other. You can do all of this without forcing Muslims to pick a side and thinking that Muslims can only prosper by taking one of the sides. We know that the revival of Islam happened at a critical stage where there were competing superpowers of the Persians and the Byzantines. Sometimes it's good for Muslims to have competing superpowers. Sometimes it's good for Muslims to be born out of a pragmatic approach of navigating through the multi-layered complexities of the nation-state world order that we find ourselves in. But for the anti-imperialists and some of our allies on the left, it has to be this or that, us or them, a very Bush approach. Either you're with the anti-imperialists against the evil imperialists and the Zionist agenda, or you're basically part of that side. And that has been the overarching narrative around Syria from the likes of Galloway, David Miller, Craig Murray, and others.
It's been very
yeah, Max Blumenthal, Richard Medhurst, Grey Zone, all these kind of contributors, journalists, commentators that have done fantastic work on the issue of Palestine and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Over Syria, Damascus fell, and they've kind of resorted back to the very same dehumanization that the Zionist occupiers and the imperialists would do. And with some of them, it was never a secret. I must also add that. Sorry, forgive me.
Like Galloway, as you say.
Galloway, Max Blumenthal, Richard Medhurst. Some of these guys, their position on Syria was very much well known anyway, but people kind of forgot because we've been occupied with a genocide in Gaza. Also, there is a younger Gen Z generation that didn't necessarily follow what was happening in Syria. Think of it like this. If you're under the age of 30, it is highly unlikely that you would have followed events of the Arab Spring attentively because it happened 14 years ago. If you're 30 now, you would have been 15, 16 at that time. Unless you were someone who already followed news and current affairs and the affairs of the Ummah, it's highly unlikely that you'd know the intricacies of the different groups and what happened and the multi-layered players externally and which commentators in the West supported who and what. You wouldn't be privy to that. So it's obviously important for younger viewers and listeners to know about this very important context about how Palestine and Syria has kind of basically fractured what, at least for the best part of 13 months, seemed to be a unified effort from many, even the Christian nationalists that I hosted. Me personally, I'm sorry, Paul, I'm going to say something a bit radical for some, but I think it's a mainstream Islamic belief. There can never be permanent alliances with non-Muslim actors. I'm sorry, that may come as a shocking.
That's as I was thinking. The evidence which seems to suggest true. I mean, otherwise, I think
there is no long-term permanent alliance, or even let alone brotherhood with.
Well, we learned that from the left anyway, generally, and so they started forcing us to adopt LGBT.
Yeah, exactly.
We learned the lesson there, and we're still learning it in other alliances. Absolutely. But there is working on taqwa and bir. There is working for communal goodness. There is working together for specific objectives and specific initiatives and specific campaigns that exist. But we should never ever, right or left, Muslim, not when it pertains to non-Muslims, we should never see that the revival of this religion and this ummah will come from those pockets, and nor will their ideology or their epistemology, because fundamentally it opposes that of Islam, right? Even though I don't want to caricature the left, they're a huge spectrum and they're not one monolith, but at the core, they're materialists, and that goes, the materialists, and it goes against the very essence of Islam. And there might be revolutionary causes that we align on, and there'll be other issues that we don't align on. The point is, we don't take them as permanent allies. Different times and different places and different contexts will demand from the Muslims to pick who they're allied with, but it should always uncompromisingly be according to our values and our worldview, inshallah ta'ala. Yeah, no, I think that's very well said. An important lesson to learn, actually, for all of us. So thank you. I think my last question is a completely different subject, actually.
Go for it.
It's about you, Dilly, because you're such an incredible journalist. You've met some amazing people. You're always there where the action is. What do you see, if I may be personal, to your own career as a journalist? How do you see your future as a journalist? What kind of work do you anticipate getting involved in? Will you still be going to the hot spots and interviewing the people that really matter, the game changers in our world? Where do you see yourself in a few years' time, or 5 years' time, or 10 years' time? Because it's your extremely interesting career you've had so far.
It has, and alhamdulillah, I'm grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first and foremost. And of course, I'm very grateful to Rasha Muhammad Saleh, my editor-in-chief, my business partner for many years, for trusting me to do these assignments. Our donors, our supporters, our well-wishers who have given us the ability to do the work that we've been doing. 2024 has been such a hectic year for me and Five Pillars. And just the last 4 months, think about it. In August 2024, I was in Afghanistan.
Yes.
October 2024, I was in Bangladesh.
In Afghanistan, by the way, Peter, you were meeting the top people.
Yes, there's all this senior guys.
To the top every time.
Yeah, and because I've set that standard now, I can't accept anything less.
We don't go to Washington next. We just expect you to have tea with Trump. I mean, why did you meet with Trump? Yeah.
No, but there's a reason why I'm obviously visiting these key countries, because there's change happening in these countries, and we want to be able to help and assist, whether that means chipping in with our 2 pence, helping from an ummatic point of view, what expertise and specialities and professions can we connect in terms of building bridges. This is important. It's not just journalism that we do. I mean, if I just go there and did interviews and podcasts and I've got the exclusives and the scoops with all the who's, that's all good and well. And that is a significant part of my job role. But there's also the kind of building connections, building ties, connecting everyday Muslims with these countries. There's that's why with every visit that I do, I always try to do a short film, whether it's a bit travel vloggy or something that's a bit cultural, something a bit lighter, because I want Muslims to connect with Syria. I want Muslims to connect with Bangladesh. I want Muslims to connect with Afghanistan. And if all they're getting is hardcore, hard-hitting podcasts and interviews, I want to give them something a bit lighter. The point is, if the Ummah have sacrificed, and they have in Bangladesh, and they have in Afghanistan, and they certainly have in Syria, if they have given their blood and their life and their honor to get rid of tyranny and occupation in these countries, we have a duty as Muslims to give back to these countries. That's my position. That's my outlook, that if I see a Muslim country, a Muslim majority country, which has struggled, has sacrificed to remove tyranny and to get rid of oppression, then once they succeed in that, and in many cases we're not even involved in that process. We're not even involved in the process of sacrifice. I mean, all we can do is and I'm not downplaying what Blogging Theology or Five Pillars does, but ultimately we're not sacrificing ourselves physically, are we, Paul?
No, of course.
Nor are we funding these revolutions with thousands of pounds, because number one, we don't have that wealth, and if we did, I'm sure we wouldn't invest that much into these revolutions. But the point is, after they've done the sacrifice and succeeded and Allah has given them victory, we should give back. We should visit, and we should harmonize relations between these countries that are going through serious changes, and we hope positive changes, and the Ummah in understanding how they can give back. And so besides the journalism, there is this kind of advocacy / activism in terms of trying to create a synergy between the different parts of the Muslim majority world. And I'm thankful to Five Pillars and Rosham for enabling that. It's also qadr of Allah that 2024 was that year, that so many things happened. Syria happened, Bangladesh happened, the 3rd anniversary of the Afghan liberation.
Where do you, looking at 2025, if you can look at a crystal ball, which you can't, of course, where do you expect to go next? Well, what's going to be your big thing?
More foreign assignments, wherever there is something happening in the Muslim majority world of this seismic significance that we saw in Syria, Bangladesh, and in 2021 in Afghanistan. Rest assured, your brother Dilly Hussain will be there. And inshallah ta'ala, we'll be speaking to the key people, the movers and shakers, and we deliver on that, right? You may not agree with us everything on editorially, you may not agree with our personal positions on current affairs and religion, but you can rest assured that Five Pillars will deliver you content, interviews, podcasts, short films with the most important people in these countries. When I went to Afghanistan, I spoke to Zabiullah Mujahid, who's basically the 3rd in charge, spoke to Abdul Qahar Balki, the spokesman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, spoke to the head of police of Kabul, spoke to all their main key guys. Went to Bangladesh, I met with the leader of Jamaat-e Islam, Dr. Shafiqur Rahman. I spoke with the press secretary of Professor Muhammad Yunus, the head of the interim government. And in Syria, I met with Ubayda Arnout, the official spokesman and the head of the political bureau of the transitional government. And of course, the man himself, Ahmad al-Shara, Abu Mahmoud al-Julani. So we are delivering. When we say that we will get these interviews, we will get those interviews. We'll try our utmost best to get those interviews. So if 2025, the Gregorian year of 2025, has these type of events taking place, rest assured that I will be there on the ground, inshallah ta'ala.
Thank you very much indeed, Dilly, for your time. I know you're incredibly busy and you have other commitments today as well. So I'm very grateful indeed that you should come on BT to share your extraordinary story and your independent, what's that word that George Galloway famously, your journalism is unassailable and it will not be defeated. And
thank you.
It's absolutely extraordinary. So thank you for that. And take care, and we'll see you next time, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, brothers and sisters. Walaikum salam. Take care.
Thank you.